now, you're probably aware of Billy Carson's disastrous debate with Wes Huff, where Wes completely dismantled his objections to Christianity. And ironically, despite Billy going on a mission to attack the God of the Bible, all of this is what led Joe Rogan to invite Wes on his podcast to discuss the debate. And Rogan didn't hold back, saying this about Billy.
Listen, I like Billy, but it's very unfortunate when people get caught with their pants down.
But here's the thing. The stuff about Billy isn't even the highlight of the podcast. What happened next could mark a pivotal moment, not just for Rogan, but how his millions of listeners think about Christianity. This wasn't just a conversation about Billy's mistakes. It became an opportunity for Rogan to finally hear the facts about his objections to Christianity.
Because the New Testament is utter horse
in a way he almost certainly hasn't heard before. So let's dive into the most fascinating moments of this discussion and why I'm convinced that God divinely orchestrated this entire Billy situation with this very moment in mind. Okay, but now that we're 3 hours into the conversation, Rogan made a claim that actually shocked me when he said it.
Because it's like real easy to lean into the fun stuff. It's real easy to lean into the Anunnaki stuff, but the actual real that we know is 100% the accounts of people that lived back then.
Yeah.
That to me is as fascinating, if not more, than even we were made by aliens. Like all of it is bizarre.
Now, if you know Joe Rogan, you know that he loves ancient alien theories. So for him to say that the historical evidence for Christianity is just as fascinating is a really big deal. But at this point, we're almost 3 hours in and there's only 15 minutes left in the podcast. And it was at the 3-hour mark that I thought to myself, you know, this apologetic stuff is cool and it seems to be really needed since Rogan hasn't been exposed to it, but I know that the podcast is going to be wrapping up soon, and I just wish that Rogan could have at least heard the gospel. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, with less than 10 minutes left in the podcast, Wes asked Rogan a question that changed everything. Seemingly sensing that he was running out of time, he asked Rogan the question that we all wanted to know the answer to.
In all of this, what do you think of Jesus? Like, in terms of your own, like, journeying and trying to find answers to ultimate questions. What do you think of the historical person of Jesus?
And Rogan's response was revealing.
Well, it certainly seems like there's a lot of people that believe that there was this very exceptional human being that existed. So the question is, what does that mean? Does it mean he was the Son of God? Does it mean he was just some completely unique human being that had this vision of humanity and this way of educating people and spreading this ideology that would ultimately change the way human beings interact with each other forever? So is he the Son of God? Well, are we all? That's another question. Right? Or do we all have that inside of us? Do we all have that ability to change everything around us inside of us? Do we all have that unique connection to the divine? And is he a representation of the best version of that? Or was he an actual person that was the Son of God? And is it important?
Yeah.
I don't know. What it can do to people is offer them a very unique way to change the way they feel about the world itself. So it does work. If you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true, but you have to submit to this concept that this guy was the child of God who came down to earth, let himself be crucified, came back from the dead, explained a bunch of stuff for people, and then said, all right, see you when I come back.
because the New Testament is utter horse.
At this point, it was clear that Rogan said what he's been saying for a while now, that Jesus may have been a good guy and that Christianity is a good framework for living. But this view seems to stem from his conversations with people like Jordan Peterson, who often present Jesus as a useful archetype rather than the Son of God. But what Rogan didn't know was that his statement was actually perfectly set up for Wes to present the gospel in a way that Rogan and millions of listeners may have never heard before.
I think I really like the way that Jordan Peterson articulates it, but I think he misses the forest for the trees.
How so?
In that he sees Jesus as an archetype. And I don't think actually even Jesus gives you the opportunity to see him as the archetype. Because I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff, because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over.
And is the crossover, you think, connected to a life in academia? Or
No.
What do you think it is?
I wonder, and I'd love to talk to him about this, like how do you remedy this issue that, because he seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example is more important than the actual flesh and blood, first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. That's an example for us to look on and live by. But I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior. And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that because Jesus was very against moralism.
And Rogan's seeming intrigue asked,
And how do you define Jesus being against moralism? Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
and here's where Wes was probably like, I'm glad you asked. But just when I thought that this podcast was going to end without Rogan hearing the gospel, little did Rogan know his question would open him up to hearing the gospel message.
Well, Jesus looks at the religiosity of his day with like particular groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these other groups of Jews during his day. So like the Pharisees, who are like lay scholars, and the Sadducees, who are professional priest scholars. And he's constantly critiquing the fact that they have this hypocritical religiosity to them. Like Jesus critiques them for that because he says, you're trying to do everything right and you're missing the point. So when he says, you have heard it said, do not commit murder. But I say to you, anybody who harbors a hate for their brother in their heart has already committed murder. And what he's getting to is like, what's the intention? What's the meaning of the law that God gives to you? Because the law is like a mirror. It shows you how dirty you are. But his critique is he's like, you guys are trying to clean yourself with a mirror. That's stupid. It's just if anything, it's gonna make you more messy. Like, get in the shower. The law is not what cleans you. The law is what reveals that you're dirty. And so in that sense, I think, if Jesus is a moral example, it actually misses what I think Jesus actually said about what his purpose was, in that you can't do enough to actually live up to the standard that God holds you to. And so if you keep striving, you're actually going to wear yourself out and be exhausted.
My prayer is that God uses this conversation to bring the truth of Christianity, not just to Rogan, but to his millions of listeners, Billy Carson's audience, and the millions of skeptics and anyone else that's watching this.